I knew I should have started that cough drop earlier. Can you remember the first day of school? Some of the fun experiences, your first time there. Now, I'm a little older than some of you, so maybe my description won't quite fit yours, but I still remember that Big Chief red notebook and those pencils. Mom wouldn't let me sharpen them because you're supposed to wait till the teacher tells you to sharpen them one at a time. But my desk that fit me and my lunchbox, and I got 2 shiny pennies because that's how much a pint of milk cost back then. First day of school, first day of anything is a exciting, fun time. And that's what we're looking at tonight in Acts chapter 2. It's the first day of the church. It is the birthday of the church. Now remember, the church in the Old Testament was a mystery, something that was not revealed. So nobody knew anything about it. We have some teaching of the Lord in Matthew chapter 16, in that vicinity where he says things like, I will build my church. But even there, we don't really have very much of a concept yet of what it's going to be like. So imagine that first day when the church began and some of the excitement of the crowd that's there. And that's what we, I think, are reading about here at the end of chapter 2. Now, we're in a new series on church polity in the book of Acts. Polity means practice or the things that you do. And we want our church habits, practices, to look like what the Bible describes. And that's why we're reviewing this, partly in preparation for nearer the end of this year when we hope to be able to have the Constitution completely revised and ready to roll out. The elders had another long meeting today, and we made about a thimbleful of progress. It was good, but we just had some sticking points that we needed to talk through, and we're not still quite there. I can tell you quickly what it was. It's the whole question of what is the role of women in the church. Now, our church, for its first 50 years, has been a deacon-ruled church, and that's unbiblical. So we've been moving away from that for several years now. We have a group of elders, and we're moving toward what we have already agreed upon here, and that is a congregational church, a congregational government is elder-led and deacon-served. Now, that's a big change. It's radical, really, for our church. It's not radical even within Baptist circles. In history, there have been a lot of Baptist churches that were patterned in the same way. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're not doing anything of the sort. But one of our discussions has been, well, what about deaconesses? Is there such a thing as male and female deacons? And where do we stand on that? And the bigger question is, what is the role of women in the church? And we're not fighting and arguing over it, not by a long shot. We want to be able to say it properly and certainly biblically, reflect what the Bible says about it. So that's been a lot of what this sermon series is going to be all about. What does the Bible say about these different subjects? And tonight it is how does the church work together? What are some of the characteristics, some of the things that ought to characterize what a local church looks like? And hopefully it's going to describe 90% or more of exactly what we are and what we're doing. We're not that far off base. There are always some things that we should look at again and maybe improve and keep working on. And I think we'll see some of that tonight here in Acts chapter 2. Let me begin by reading the passage. I am starting actually at verse 42, but as I was looking at it, 41 is really included here. You know the beginning of the chapter and the things that happened on the day of Pentecost as the church was gathered in the upper room, and then probably down at the southern temple entrances for this occasion, because none of the rooms would hold 3,000 people plus. You have to have a location big enough to handle it. You've also got to have a reason for such a number of people to be together. And that is, of course, this Jewish pilgrim holiday when Men and women and families from all over the country would have been gathered at Jerusalem. They've had their mikveh, their ritual immersion bath, and they are now prepared to go up into the temple courtyards and worship the Lord. And on those front steps, Peter preaches. And that, by the way, is a nice starting point here. This section that we're going to look at comes after some great preaching. I think that is a significant element of any good church, any great church, that it is the power of the pulpit that draws people in and instructs and feeds and causes growth and application and great spiritual strength. And that's certainly the case here. Peter's sermon is powerful as he goes through this. And then down to verse 41, so then, those who had received his word were baptized, and that day there were added about 3,000 souls. Since I'm not going to be preaching on that, let me just say something right here. We Baptists used to struggle a little bit with that. They were all baptized because how on earth are you going to baptize 3,000 people in Jerusalem? Where do you get enough water to do such a thing? And, I remember people saying things like, well, they maybe ran down to the Jordan River and baptized there. Well, that's possible. You can run down there, but you're not going to run back up again, especially not in the same day. And things are going on in this day. And since in the last 35 to 50 years now, multiple mikvaot, ritual immersion baths or tanks, have been found in the excavations there. There's more than 50 of them in close proximity. One of them is one tank that's a third of the size of this whole room. You could easily baptize dozens, maybe even a couple hundred at a time in there. So there are some logistic situations here. I mean, how did the apostles or whoever else was authorized to do so, how did they work them through? Was it, a dunking ceremony there pretty fast, or did everybody give a personal testimony? We don't have those kinds of details here, but it does say 3,000, and that's another point to be drawn from this. They were adding, they were counting, they were looking at the numbers. Now, it's always a temptation. It's something that I think we really do need to be careful about. When we pastors get together, and I just came from the BNN conference over in Everett, one of the first things that people ask is, how's your church doing? And one of the first answers is, we're up to 300 now, or something like that. And we talk about numbers. And that can easily be wrong. It can easily be completely the wrong motivation in that. But when you go to the doctor's office for an appointment, what's the first thing they do? They take all your vital signs. They figure out what your temperature is, how many pounds you put on, how tall you are still, and they're looking at numbers because those are a quick reference point to growth and health, or the lack thereof. So it's not entirely wrong to talk about how healthy our offerings are, or how many people have been coming, or how many Bible studies we have going. If that's your focus, if that's your purpose, then no, that's not good. But they're counting here. In fact, they keep on counting. There were 120 back in chapter 1 in the upper room. Now there's 3,000, and pretty soon there's going to be 5,000 men, and before very long, they couldn't count them anymore in Jerusalem. And these people are going out. There's 17 different nations that are involved in this on this occasion, and they spread out all over the Roman world. And I'm pretty sure that they were sending reports and counting and calculating and figuring out something about the growth of the local churches. So it's not wrong, as long as your motivation is not wrong. Now, here's our segment. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. Now, there are a lot of details scattered through this text, and we're going to take a look at it. First of all, in verses 42 and 43, they were a covenanted community. The emphasis is on their gathering together and doing multiple things together. We'll look at that as we work our way down. But one of the first things that you notice is that they were devoted to studying and teaching. That teaching is from the basic word didache. It is often the content that's involved, as well as the style or the means of teaching or proclaiming there. They were devoted to studying and teaching. It says they were continually devoting themselves to this. Now, that's not a necessarily common or popular idea in our day and age when you've got a lot of non-commitment, a lot of people that aren't stuck on something in any extended way. Think of marriage, for instance. In our generation, in our country, some people change marriages just about as often as they change clothes. It's just the common way of life. The idea of a long-term commitment and faithfulness is increasingly rare. We struggle with something like that even in the missionary world. I remember when I was a kid, you went for a long-term mission, and the long term meant 4 years and come back for a year and then go back for 4 more years and keep doing that all your life. And you had to start young or they wouldn't take you. Nowadays, it's hard to get a 6-week commitment for a short-term group. 2 weeks, okay, maybe we can do that. And, we might get somebody that'll go to one of those and another one somewhere else and maybe another one pretty soon, and we start getting tired of funding their vacations. The idea of going with a long-term commitment and staying there and sticking through when it's hard is pretty rare, even in evangelical missionary ministries. They are continually devoting themselves to what? To the apostles' teaching. They were a very learning church. That's the result of being devoted to this. They were all about studying together. I don't know if they had Sunday school quarterlies or some kind of printed materials. Probably not. But they also had the apostles, which we don't have. Can you imagine listening to Peter week after week expound suffering? Or listen to Paul week after week, like he did at the school of Tyrannus in Ephesus for 3 years, continually preaching and giving that level of instruction. They were devoted to that, and it says they were continually doing it. Now, that emphasis on continually or being devoted to something is going to be a common theme through most of the points in what follows. The next one, for instance, they were devoted to fellowship. And that word, should be familiar to you. You've all heard of koinonia. Well, this is a takeoff on that same word, kinonikos. It's the idea of coming together and in several different levels here. Fellowship is not just pie social after the evening service. Well, that's a pretty good starting point, especially if you have rhubarb. It's so much more. It's having things in common. And of course, in this particular context, we quickly are going to find out that they were putting everything together in common. I'll wait till we get to that to develop that a little bit more. But it says they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the breaking of bread. This is probably not yet the Lord's Supper. They didn't have any background. It is not the same as what we do in a communion service, is not the same as what they did in a Passover. Now, it grew out of a Passover, but that was just a few weeks before. And that was with a fairly tight circle of disciples that saw and heard the explanation. Paul later is going to say, this is what we learned on the night that Jesus was about to die. And he shared the elements that become part of what we commonly call the Lord's Supper. This is simply breaking of bread. I think these are meals. Some element of fellowship or worship together with it, but they're going from house to house, not just when they come together as a church assembly. They were devoting themselves continually to the breaking of bread. This was the birthday of the church, and consequently, a lot of those kinds of details are not fleshed out yet. When we get to chapter 6, we'll be looking at what is very probably the beginning of the deacons, but there are some significant differences in Acts 6 as compared to, say, 1 Timothy 3. By 1 Timothy 3, it's an established order or position of leadership in the church. So something had to happen between Acts 6 and 1 Timothy 3. And of course, you've got 3 decades or more of time that passes before that comes about. They were continually devoting themselves, thirdly here, to prayer. There's a couple things that we have to, I think, observe from the original language on that. And I don't make any apology for referring to Greek and Hebrew because those are the languages the Bible was written in. But please don't ever get the idea that if you don't know the original languages, you can't study the Bible. You do need to use the tools that are available for you. So at this point, if you were looking at an interlinear or something else, even Strong's numbering system, you'd be able to notice, first of all, that the word prayer is singular in English, but in the original it's plural. They gave themselves continually to prayers, and it has a definite article. They gave themselves to the prayers. Now, I think we best can understand that out of a Jewish background. Remember, these are all Jewish believers at this point. No Gentiles yet in the church. And these are people who have been used to going to the temple, as on this occasion, or to their local synagogue for the prayers. In the Jewish system, there are designated times for prayers. There's a morning prayer. There's an afternoon prayer. And that, I think, is what's going on in a context like this. When I was in the tour guides course, the men would often get up early in the morning, and wherever we were, every hotel in Israel, every youth hostel has a room that's designated as the synagogue. And as long as you have 10 men to gather, then you form a minyan, and that's the minimum number necessary for having public prayers. You can pray alone anytime, anywhere, but in order to have public prayers and to pray through the prayer book at that point, you have to have 10 men. So our group was pretty secular. In fact, our group was just a microcosm of Israel. We had 2 fairly Orthodox rabbis and 2 fairly Reformed or liberal rabbis. We had a Presbyterian black woman preacher converted to Judaism in our group. And we had all kinds. I mean, we had 2 Arabs. We had all kinds of secular people of every sort. And there were 4 of us that were believers, but only 2 of us were willing to be identified as such. And at one point, we were late in the afternoon, early on, and it was time for the afternoon prayer, and they were running out of time. The sun was going down, and the guys were asking the leader, can we stop? Can we stop? It'll only take us 5 minutes, but can we stop? And they would hop off the bus and have their prayer for the afternoon. And finally, he, in desperation himself, said, well, if you feel the need to pray, okay. Well, that little phrase got repeated quite often by all of us, myself included. Yeah, I kind of do feel the need to pray on occasion. And so here's what happened. We would have overnight trips once a month, and we'd be staying at a youth hostel or something like that. And in the morning, those men, not everybody, but those guys would get up early and put their prayer shawls on and have their morning prayers. So here I am, the Christian guy in the middle of that. And I didn't ever want to give the wrong impression. I was not trying to be Jewish or out-Jewish them. But I would go to the synagogue group, and I would just sit in the back, and I would read my Bible and pray while they were having their public prayers. And you know what? I gained so much respect for that little act. You know, they totally disagree with me. They think I'm praying to the wrong person and everything else. But they respected that I respected their prayers. So this idea of the prayers is probably that kind of a Jewish context. Now, it does change with the entrance of Gentiles, and within a few chapters, the church is spreading all across Asia Minor, and beyond that, that whole concept of having designated hours for prayer definitely changes. It's something that's in the Old Testament. Remember the story of Daniel? 5 times a day, he got down and opened the window. 3 times a day. Thank you, Concordance. Opened the windows. It's the Muslims that have it 5 times a day. Jewish people, it's 3. Opened the windows toward Jerusalem and prayed. And that's a significant factor. You pray in the direction of Jerusalem. And that comes all the way from Solomon's dedication of the temple. He says it repeatedly there. So I think that's how we should understand this. This was growing out of their Old Testament experience. And please don't despise that in any way. That was God's system, and it worked very well for 1,400 years since Moses, and some of that predates Moses. So they have now come into the birthday of the church, and they're still in their good habit of regular public prayers. And they dedicated themselves, they devoted themselves to prayer. D.A. Carson has a great book called A Call to Spiritual Reformation. And he has something to say about prayer, and this is where we get down to some application, I think, on this as well. Show me a church where the choir is known as the War Department, where people divide over evangelistic strategies or over the color of the carpet, and I'll show you a church that has not been praying. Conversely, we will see profound spiritual renovation if, by God's grace, we make it our commitment not to put anyone down except on our prayer lists. Folks, this is something that our church needs to pay more attention to. We have regular prayer time every Sunday morning here at church. We have a group for the elders and deacons. We have a group for the men. We have a group for the women. We even have a group for the children. So you don't have any excuse. And it only takes about a half an hour extra commitment. Are you willing to get down on your knees before the Lord for that much time once a week? That is absolutely minimal. We ought to be crowding all the rooms in the hallway instead of jabbering in the hallway while a handful are trying to pray. Please take this into serious consideration. Some of you have just kind of written it off your list. You came once or twice in the past and it's just too hard and you got all kinds of excuses, and that's all they are terrible excuses. Please make this a habit. If we're going to get into a building program and trying to raise mega bucks toward that, and all of the confusion and stuff that's going to go on in trying to see that project through to the end, we better not try it without heaps of prayer. I wish that we could see a significant change in our church in that area. Are we devoting ourselves to the prayers? Now look at the result here. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe. That's something that we all desire. And we all experience that from time to time. I think this morning was one of those aha moments for many of us. And, we sensed the moving of the Lord, the Holy Spirit, in our service this morning. But that ought to be something that we continually experience. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe. And many wonders and signs were taking place. And notice very carefully the last phrase there, through the apostles. We don't have the apostles anymore. And therefore, we are not looking for signs and wonders in that sense anymore. That was a foundational phase in the beginning and the formation of the church, which was very important. And 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, and Romans chapter 12 have a lot to say about those spiritual gifts, and particularly some of those sign gifts that were for this time and not continuing till our day. So don't misunderstand a phrase like that and say, oh, we're missing something here because we don't have all these signs and wonders taking place all the time. That was something that was unique through the apostles. But the first part of that sentence is not unique. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe as they saw what God was doing there. So they were a covenanted community. That means they were fellowshipping. They were banded together. They had the word compromise is really the right word, but it sounds like a bad thing in English. The idea of coming together with a promise, a common promise together. They were covenanted together on this occasion. Verses 44 through 46, they were also a very caring community. Take a look at those verses. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. In the meantime, I got to catch up to where I was supposed to be. Sorry. There we go. All who believed were together and had all things in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart. Well, there's a lot of repetition there from what we just looked at, but this is like the next phase. These are the next several days or weeks or months, and it describes the life together that they had as a very caring community. So first of all, my point is they were devoted to being together. It says, all those who had believed. And that is an essential element of a biblical local church. It is to be a body of believers. That's why we take care in our membership process. And we examine those people who want to join. We ask questions. Are you born again? When did that happen? What did it look like? What evidence is there of that? And have you been baptized biblically? The baptism doesn't save, but it's usually a pretty good indicator if they were biblically baptized as knowledgeable, I was going to say adults, but knowledgeable children as well can be baptized. Then there's a fairly good probability that they knew what they were doing and are genuinely born again. But we want to examine that. Jonathan Edwards, after 23 years in his church, got put out over that very point. His father-in-law had a very different idea that the church was supposed to be like the local assembly for the whole community, and there were going to be some tares among the wheat, and there would definitely be some people that weren't born again, and he thought that was perfectly fine, and a lot of people did, but as Jonathan was preaching and preaching and preaching, he came to a strong conviction, no, a church is supposed to be a band of born-again brothers and sisters. And when he tried to press that, the church put him out. Kind of interesting there. He went to work with the Indians. His hoped to be, didn't finally work out, but David Brainerd was dating his daughter, one of his daughters, and was a missionary to the Indians, and so Jonathan Edwards went and preached to the Indians. And that's a fascinating study because he took some of his sermon notes that he had preached at his big fancy church, and he used the same notes when he preached to the Indians, but he changed the illustrations. He used illustrations about the wind and the river and the leaves and things that the Indians would be very, very familiar with that would really illustrate at their level. A very interesting concept of what is good biblical preaching. Jonathan Edwards is often called the greatest American theologian of all times. And he was as deep goes, but he could preach to Indians. These people were devoted to being together. And look at the words there. They were together. They met together. They ate together. And the emphasis is that they were together. It was being together, not just meeting together for their public services. Barclay says, God knows nothing of solitary religion. Now, this is not a given. I mean, in America, even in a gated community where you're tight together inside there, there's not very much in common between people. Sometimes you don't even know your neighbors. But it says that they were together in all these things. Now, certainly, the beginning here is in assembly. That is one of the necessary elements of being together in a community like that. And we have actually a clear reference to that in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. This is something that we need. This isn't something to just make the preacher happy. Quite the contrary. This is something that is essential for our own spiritual health. That we come together and we mutually support one another with our prayers and our fellowship and in every other way. Notice specifically here it says, breaking bread from house to house. Here I go again. Let me catch up. Breaking bread from house to house. That terminology is often used for regular meals, and that is a basis for having potluck suppers at church, getting together for the meals. We hope to have a big enough space where we can do it. At this point, they didn't have any kind of a building, and eating meals inside the temple grounds was not the thing to do. So they would go around from house to house. That's been one of our regrets as our church has grown. Our fellowship hall just isn't big enough. We can cram in maybe 100 people, and it's not very comfortable to do so. So we end up opening some rooms down the hallway or trying different creative ways to be able to have meals together. But when I started here, we would have one a month. I remember scheduling those. Every month we'd have some kind of a potluck meal together. So that's one of our great hopes in this building project, that we can have a multi-purpose building on the back of our property where we can all have a meal together again and assemble together. Even now here, the only way we can assemble is to have some people go in the east wing. And by the way, one of the things that the building committee is working hard on, and we're getting very close now to some decisions on this, is to take out everything here and put in 3 more rows of 19 chairs. That's 57 more chairs here. Cram you together a little bit more so we can put at least 1 more row at the back and try to deal with our population explosion that way. That does not address our parking issues. We have need for parking spaces. So this is just a stopgap. This is just a temporary fix, and we've got a long ways to go in the future to address some of the other issues there. But that's what this church was doing. All of a sudden they had 3,000 people. Where do we meet? How do we do this? How can we get together? How can we help those brand new believers to grow in their new faith? Notice it does say here, breaking bread from house to house, and they were in the temple courts. That's some of the ongoing Jewish flavor. The shift here was gradual. It wasn't until sometime later that those believers in Jesus got to be known as followers of the Way, and the Jewish Orthodox community felt that the Way was heretical, and they began to persecute them. They were first called Christians, not a term of endearment, those little Christs up in Antioch. This is still very much a Jewish church. All of them are Jewish believers to begin with, and they are rejoicing there in the temple courts. Now, I've shown pictures like this on more than one occasion, but you can see something of the courts that were available to them. First of all, the big open space around there is the courtyard of the Gentiles. Does not mean that only Gentiles were there. It just means Gentiles couldn't go past there. And if you look at more of a map of it, you can see there's a courtyard of the women, a courtyard of the men, and then the sanctuary and the courtyards of where the priests worked as well. That overall floor plan is the equivalent of 7 football fields. We're talking about lots of space. And all the way around the outer ring of that is a colonnaded walkway known as Solomon's Portico. So there were lots of places for groups to gather, large and small, and people to be together there in the temple courts. I imagine there were all kinds of Bible studies and small groups going on. It was on one and a much earlier occasion that Jesus was there stumping the rabbis and the chief priests with his questions and his answers to their questions. It was a common element in the temple courtyards through all of that time, and I think these early believers continued in exactly that tradition. So they were devoted to being together, but in the next phrase here, we find that they were also devoted to each other. Specifically, it says they had everything in common. Now, let's use care here. This is commonism. It's not communism. And there is several significant differences in what we have here. First of all, this was entirely voluntary. That's been one of the problems of Soviet-style communism, or in China or elsewhere. It is forced upon people, and it is extremely restrictive. This was exactly the opposite. It was something that was temporary. We only have this described for us there in Jerusalem in these opening days. It was something that was very localized when the church began to spread elsewhere. This wasn't something that just kept repeating itself elsewhere. It was entirely God-honoring. They were meeting the needs of other believers there, and it was entirely love-based. All of that, voluntary, temporary, local, God-honoring, love-based, all of that is contrary to communism as we know it in our world. This was a commonism. It was fellowship in words and worship, which becomes then fellowship also in goods. And that leads into yet another point here, and then I want to put those two together. They were devoted to being generous. Notice the phrase, they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all. There's that word koinonikos again, the idea of sharing together. And it says specifically, it defines it as anyone might have need. So they saw the poverty of many. They saw the needs, and they opened their hearts. They were willing to share like that. And I've said many times, both at home and abroad, and I gladly will continue to repeat it with every breath, our church is a very generous church. We many times have gone way beyond what could have been expected in the way that we meet the needs, not just of missionaries, but in many cases. We have Deacons Benevolent Fund that puts out $10,000 to $12,000 every year in specific needs. We have many other quick projects and things that we do that aren't necessarily missions related. And when it comes to missionary giving, there are not very many churches in America today that do any better than we do on a per capita basis. But don't let's scratch ourselves on the back with this. We know we can do a lot more than what we're doing. And God is going to be calling upon us in the next 2 years to do a lot more if we're going to be able to see that new building in the back and see that level of expansion. We're going to have to make some sacrifices. And we're going to have to do even what they say here. They were selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all. There are a lot of things that are parked in your garage, big and small, that you don't need, you never use. And maybe we need to do some kind of a capital campaign where people can make commitments at that level and sell some of those unused articles and turn that money into some new space and fellowship room here in our congregation. Barclay has, again, a really good phrase at this point. He says, a real Christian cannot bear to have too much when others have too little. And let me tell you, the best cure, if that's a problem that you deal with, the best cure I can think of is take a trip to Africa or just about anywhere else in the world. Maybe a few of the European countries wouldn't work quite as well, but go anywhere in South America, go anywhere in Africa, go anywhere, I assume in Asia. I haven't been there myself. But you see the poverty of people around you. You remember Kikwit, Congo. In the heart of Congo, it takes 15, 16 hours to drive there from the capital. A population of 3 million people, no electricity, no running water, and no sewer. You talk about abject poverty, and then come back to America. I want to tell you, it is crushing to see the extreme wealth that we have in this country. We are absolutely filthy, obnoxiously rich in America. Now, it may not seem that way. If you're struggling to get to the end of the month, and if you are without a job or something right now, I'm sure you're feeling differently. But when you compare what we have with what others don't have, there absolutely is no comparison. And so we can afford to be generous. Now, the context here is within a local church. We have members here that have some pretty desperate needs. Those of us who have something extra ought to be helping with those needs, ought to be identifying them and doing what we can to share with all of those that have need. Two of the upcoming problems here in the book of Acts are related to this area. In chapter 5, you've got Ananias and Sapphira. And that's going to be a very interesting subject when we get there. We'll be talking a lot more about giving, and our point right now is generosity. They were under no compulsion to give everything. Their problem wasn't that they held some back for themselves. They could have done that. They could have held it all back for themselves. There was no obligation. But they lied to the Holy Spirit and led others to believe that this was the total, and they held it back on a pretense. And what happened? Struck dead instantly. So if we were going to do church polity in the book of Acts in this church, we need to put a morgue in the hallway down there. Have it ready for those kinds of things to happen. Now, I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting we ought to take a closer look at what we have and what others don't have and be very sensitive in this area. The other one is the widow's distribution in chapter 6. And some inequities apparently in the way that it was being distributed, and that the church then chose men that would be able to administer that so that the apostles, the preachers, would be free to preach and pray. And the church grew greatly as a result of that. There has to be balance, of course, in this idea of sharing and being generous. Edith Schaefer has several really good books. Don't tell anybody, but I like her writing better than I like her husband's, just because her husband's writings are so hard. You really have to think if you're going to read Francis Schaeffer. And Edith is just kind of so common and helpful. She has a really good little book called What is a Family? And the title to one of the chapters is A Door with Hinges and a Lock. And that's true for all of us. We are not called to be so openly public. We have nothing of our own. We have no interests of our own. We have no time for ourselves or for our family. That's not what is being promoted in a passage like this. But this generosity and seeing the needs of others and being willing, opening your heart to help with other people's needs. Now notice the result in this case. They enjoyed the favor of all the people. And again, there in verse 43, everyone was filled with awe as a result of what we've just been looking at. So it's a covenanted community, it's a caring community, and finally it's also a continuing community. I mean, look at this. Here we are, 2,000 years later, doing the same things. That's pretty impressive. Times have changed, countries have changed, languages have changed, cultures have changed, but basically we're still here doing the same things that they were doing back then. And we learn from the experiences that they had, and we experience how Jesus promised, I will build my church. So one of the next things that we can observe, verses 46 and 47, day by day, continuing with one mind, with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. They were devoted to gladness, day by day, with one mind. And that mind was filled with gladness. They expressed that. I can imagine their singing was very joyful, as ours is. I can imagine that the conversations in the hallways, if and when they started to get public meeting places, were probably joyful and glad. There was a lot of laughter. I would like to go sit in on their Arctic Circle meeting sometime and see how they did it. Barclay, again, has a great phrase here. He says, a gloomy Christian is a contradiction in terms. A gloomy Christian is like an oxymoron. And some of us need to remember that. Just because we're tired and get grumpy and we're starting to get to be an old man, that's no cause or reason whatsoever to legitimize gloominess. We've got every reason to be devoted to gladness. They were devoted to sincerity. It says here, with sincerity of heart. Very literally, that means with simplicity of heart. They weren't complicated. They weren't full of foibles. They weren't always nitpicking at things and being dishonest in the way they, somebody says, how you doing? And you just standardly say, okay, when it's not okay. Somebody just asked me this yesterday or day before yesterday, how's it going? I said, bad. And I know I shocked them because that's not what you're supposed to answer to those questions. But sometimes that kind of sincerity is necessary. And first of all, just recognizing it instead of lying, instead of saying something that isn't true. They had sincerity or simplicity of heart. Now, our word sincere comes from without wax, sincera. And that comes from a practice back then. I assume it's probably still done. When you made your ceramic pots and things, sometimes, especially in the baking process, too much heat or too little heat in the wrong spot, you'd end up with a crack. Well, if you had the right color and consistency of a good quality wax, you could fill that crack in so that the untrained eye wouldn't spot it. And the way to spot it would be to hold it up to the light of the sun, and if you could see some light coming through that crack, you knew that it was with wax. Sincera is without wax. It's not cracked. It's not faulty. That's the meaning of the word here. They had an unaffected joy, is the way the New English Bible translates that. And that says it very well. It wasn't put on. It wasn't just for effect. Thirdly, here, they were devoted to praise. And it specifically says praising God, or literally exultation. A reverent church is still the result here. Their joy was never irreverent. Pentecost was supposed to be a time of praise, sharing, and gladness, the holiday itself. And as people came to Jerusalem, it was with singing and joy and celebration. And that had all the more cause then on this birthday of the church. Fourthly, they were devoted to growth. It says they added to their number day by day. Numbers aren't everything, but they are a quick measure. They added to the number day by day those who were being saved. That indicates some care is involved. It also indicates a regenerated membership, and it indicates that they had a membership. Let's not forget that. We have a group in our church that resist membership and think that it's unbiblical, and they're just wrong. There's no other way to say it. And I talk to them every chance I get to don't be that way. Don't think that. Everything, every club, every organization, every group has a recognized membership. How much is required in order to be a member might vary greatly, but the idea that you know who's in and who isn't in. Every team has a shirt to indicate who are the team members. That's just a common, practical, human activity. And it's found everywhere here in the church. When Paul writes to the saints, which are at Philippi, with the bishops and the deacons, they're identifiable. You know who the saints are as opposed to the ones that aren't. You know who the leadership is. And here we have the beginning then of that concept of a membership. And notice the result here. The Lord added to their number daily. That means they were keeping track. They kept the count going. They had some kind of a roll book. Ruth Hasenjager would pick up all those little papers every week and record how many people were there. Glenda Ham would be seated at the back there recording who's here this week. And we find that very helpful here. Not that we're looking after people and saying, oh, you missed 3 Sundays in a row now. The boogeyman's going to come after you. But if we see that somebody has been gone 6, 7, 8, 9 Sundays, we can either detect that they're traveling and we just didn't know about it, or maybe there is a problem. And twice in my time here at the church, we've had individuals who decided they wouldn't come just to see how long it took for anybody to notice. Now, that's pretty ridiculous, but it happens, and that maybe tells us something, too, about how effective we are or aren't in shepherding and working with those people and making sure people are plugged in and nobody is just there on the outskirts. Now, it takes effort on your part to not be one of the outsiders. You need to come. You need to be here. You need to insert yourself. But we will find a job. We will find a place for every one of you that is willing to serve the Lord. Here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still doing the same things, and we are literally in the uttermost parts of the earth. They were entirely successful in getting the gospel all the way around the world over here to little old Meridian, Idaho. That is comforting. It is also challenging. It shows that we are part of a long history, a long line of faithful men and women who have done the Lord's work in every generation, in every culture, in every part of the world. In conclusion, the events of this day provide us with something of God's blueprint for the church. A couple of things that can just be observed in general here. There in verse 46, they met daily. In verse 47, they won souls daily. In chapter 6, verse 1, it says they cared for each other daily. These are all the dailies in the book of Acts. In chapter 17, verse 11, they searched the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And in chapter 16, verse 5, they increased in number daily. So how can we summarize that? First of all, they were a learning church. Remember how we started. This whole thing comes after a great sermon by Peter on the steps of the entrance to the temple area on that day of Pentecost. And we'll see that all the way through the book of Acts. There are many. We wish we had longer segments, more of the text, but lots of details about the preaching here and the preaching there. And they went into here and they spoke the gospel and they taught for 3 years. And they had outdoor, indoor services all over. One of them was in an upper room and a guy fell asleep because it went on so long. Paul went on and on and on, it says, until the early hours. I saw that, David. They were a learning church. They were also a loving church. And these ought to be characteristics of our church, of every church. But we're worried about our church. We're worried about our own example. How are we doing? What is the standard to which we need to hold ourselves and which God holds us to? And then finally, they were a living church. There was every evidence of growth. And I praise the Lord for the way that He has blessed us with that. When I first came, we had a lot of old-timers and some of their kids and not very much in the middle. And it was pretty discouraging for a while when, we'd get visitors and people would come and they didn't find anybody else in their age group, and so they'd go looking somewhere else. If they'd have just all come on the same Sunday and stayed, we could have had it. But now we can definitely see by the numbers of the children, the numbers in our youth group, the growth toward the middle, which is very healthy. We still have a long ways to go. I'm happy to pat you on the back, but I might have to kick you in the backside too once in a while for other things that we need to keep working on. Let's pray.